shutters creaking faintly in the salt-tinged wind. Shelley had owned it for 15 years, and it hadn't changed much in that time. The inn was made of thick stone, its windows narrow and latticed, the paint peeling just slightly at the edges. It suited her fine, sturdy, practical, with just enough charm to draw in a handful of guests during the warmer months. Winter, though, was quiet. The guests were few, mostly travellers passing through, or the occasional writer looking for solitude. This January was particularly slow. Most days, Shelley had the place entirely to herself. She liked it that way. Her mornings began at the same time each day, just before dawn. The alarm clock on her bedside table clicked softly, its hands moving with steady precision. She reached over, turned it off, and pulled herself from beneath the heavy quilt. Her breath was visible for just a moment before the room settled into its familiar chill. She slipped into her slippers, worn but warm, and wrapped her thick shawl around her shoulders before heading downstairs. When she entered, the kitchen was still dark, but she knew it well enough not to need the light. She filled the kettle, its weight familiar in her hands, and set it on the stove. It hissed softly, a whisper of steam curling up toward the ceiling. Shelley took her spot by the window, her hands resting on the cool surface of the counter as she watched the sky begin to pale. The waves were visible even from here, rolling in slow procession against the shore. The horizon was a thin line of silver, edged with the first hints of dawn. Shelley liked these moments, the stillness before the world woke up. She could hear the distant cries of gulls, the soft rush of wind through the beach grass. Everything was hushed, patient. When the kettle whistled, she poured the water over the tea leaves in her chipped blue teapot and let it steep. She always waited exactly 3 minutes. No more, no less. Routine was important, predictable. She reached for the bread box, pulling out 2 slices of bread and slipping them into the toaster. It hummed to life, and she watched the coils glow faintly red. As she waited, she set the table precisely. 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 small saucer for her marmalade. The toast popped up just as the tea finished steeping, and she plated it carefully, spreading a thin layer of butter, then marmalade, right to the edges. Her breakfast was always the same, and she always ate it by the window. The light grew stronger as she ate, the sky turning from pale grey to a soft, muted blue. She sipped her tea, its warmth spreading through her hands, and listened to the distant crash of waves. It was a simple thing, but it brought her comfort. When she finished, she washed the plate and cup, drying them with a linen cloth and setting them back in their places. The kettle was emptied, the countertops wiped clean, and she took one last glance out the window before moving to the front of the inn. The common room was quiet as always. 2 armchairs sat by the empty fireplace, their cushions plump and well kept. Shelley moved through Down the hall, she passed room 3, the only one occupied. A young man had checked in 2 days ago, quiet and polite. He kept mostly to himself, though she saw him walking along the beach sometimes, his coat flapping in the wind. She would see to his linens once he checked out, but for now she left, the room undisturbed. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Shelley polished the banisters, wiped down the front desk, and folded fresh linens to store in the hall closet. When she finished, she stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly around her. The wind was sharp, carrying with it the tang of salt and cold. She walked to the edge of the dunes, her boots crunching over frost-tipped grass, and looked out over the sea. It moved in slow waves, steady and constant, stretching out to the horizon where it met the sky in a pale line of blue. February, the slow thaw and gentle routines. The morning stayed cold as February crept in, the frost lingering longer on, the windowsills, the waves crashing with a deeper, more resonant rhythm. Shelley woke before dawn, her alarm clock ticking softly in the quiet. She slid her feet into her slippers, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with its familiar silence. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, its hiss breaking the stillness as she moved to the window. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, a soft, muted grey that hung low over the sea. The tide had pulled back, leaving damp stretches of sand streaked with seaweed and bits of driftwood. Shelley watched the gulls picking through the debris, their white feathers stark against the darkened shore. When the kettle whistled, she made her tea, steeping the leaves carefully. She buttered her toast with the same slow movements, spreading a thin layer of marmalade to the edges. Breakfast was always the same, simple and unhurried. She took her place by the window, the steam from her cup curling up toward the glass, fogging the corners slightly. After she washed and dried the dishes, she moved through the hallway, the wooden floors creaking faintly beneath her steps. The inn was still, the kind of stillness that settled deep into the walls, whispering of long winters and quiet days. Her feather duster was soft against the shelves, its bristles sweeping along the edges of picture frames and books. She dusted carefully, moving from one corner to the next, straightening the cushions in the common room, wiping down the mantelpiece where the old clock ticked steadily. The fireplace remained empty. There hadn't been a guest in days. She would light it if someone came, but for now it stayed dark and cold, its iron grate polished to a dull sheen. Upstairs, she began with room 1. The bed was still made, its quilt smooth and undisturbed. She pulled back the curtains, letting in the weak morning light. Outside, the beach stretched out in muted shades of brown and grey, the sea curling up against the rocks with a gentle sigh. Shelley dusted the dresser, polished the mirror, and vacuumed the rug in slow, even strokes. Room 2 before closing it tightly. The air smelled of salt and faintly of pine, crisp and clean. She fluffed the pillows, smoothed the blankets, and wiped down the nightstand. Her movements were practiced, steady, each action a small part of the morning's rhythm. When she reached room 3, she paused. The young man who had stayed there in January had left a week ago. He'd been quiet, keeping mostly to himself, and had paid in cash before heading back out into the cold morning mist. Shelly opened the door and stepped inside, the room faintly scented with the lingering trace of aftershave. She pulled back the curtains, stripped the linens, and set to work remaking the bed. Fresh sheets, crisp and cool, smoothed and tucked, just right. The quilt went back on top, folded neatly at the corners. She vacuumed slowly, listening to the hum of the machine as it moved over the carpet. Dusting came next, her hands brushing gently over the nightstand, the window ledge, the simple wooden chair tucked in the corner. By the time she finished, the room was back to its usual state, calm and ready, as if someone might arrive at any moment. Down the hall, room 4 and room 5 sat vacant. She moved through them in the same way, unhurried and meticulous. She opened the windows just for a minute, letting in the fresh breeze. The curtains fluttered softly, then settled back into place when she closed the glass. She dusted, straightened, smoothed, and tucked until everything was just as it should be. When she finished, she made her way back downstairs, pausing to look out the wide window by the front desk. The beach was empty, the waves rolling in slow and steady. A few gulls wandered near the water's edge, their calls faint and distant. Shelly watched them for a moment before moving back into the kitchen. The kettle was filled again, its weight familiar in her hands. She set it on the stove, waiting patiently as the water began to bubble and steam. The routine was always the same, calming in its predictability. She brewed another pot of tea, letting it steep for the full 3 minutes before pouring herself a cup. The liquid was dark and fragrant, its warmth spreading through her palms. Afternoons were spent in quiet tasks. She folded fresh linens, ironed the pillowcases, and polished the silverware that sat unused in the small dining room. The sideboard gleamed softly in the afternoon light, its surface smooth beneath her hands. Occasionally, she would bake a simple loaf of bread or a batch of scones, the scent of flour and butter mingling with the salt air that drifted in through the cracks in the window panes. Outside, the wind blew steadily, whispering through the dunes. The grass bent and swayed, the sea stretching out in endless grey. She watched the horizon sometimes, her hands stilling for just a moment as she listened to the soft sigh of the waves. There was something comforting about it, its constancy, its patience. It moved the same way each day, never hurried, never rushed. As the sun dipped lower, she would light a few lamps in the common room, pulling the curtains closed smiling softly as she watched the flames dance in the grate. When the dishes were washed and put away, she would settle into her chair with her knitting. The needles clicked softly, her hands moving with familiar ease. Outside, the wind would sometimes pick up, rattling the shutters, but the inn stood firm. It always had. March, the slow stir of spring. March arrived with a softness that lingered in the air, brushing away the last breath of winter. The frost that had rimed the windowsills began to fade, replaced by thin layers of morning dew that shimmered in the first light of dawn. Shelley woke as she always did, just before the sun crept up over the dunes. Her alarm clock ticked softly in the corner of her room, its steady rhythm a comfort against the silence. She slipped her feet into her slippers, worn soft from years of use, and wrapped her thick shawl around her shoulders before heading downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with its familiar stillness, and she filled the kettle, setting it on the stove with a practiced hand. Outside, the beach stretched out in muted shades of grey and beige, the tide pulling gently back from the shore. The wind was calmer now, whispering through the beach grass instead of howling. When the kettle whistled, she poured the steaming water over the tea leaves, the scent of bergamot drifting up in gentle curls. She toasted 2 slices of bread, buttered them carefully, and added a thin layer of marmalade. Her breakfast was always the same, a quiet ritual that she took by the window. Outside, the sky hung low and pale, dotted with the occasional gull wheeling overhead. March was the beginning of preparations at the seaside inn. Spring meant the slow return of travellers, writers seeking solitude, couples escaping the city for a quiet weekend, and sometimes the occasional painter who came for the light. It wasn't busy, not yet, but it would be soon. For now, Shelley took her time, moving through her morning routine with gentle deliberation. She began with her spring checklist, which she kept tucked in the front desk drawer. The paper was folded neatly, its edges soft from years of handling. She unfolded it carefully and ran her finger down the list, her eyes scanning the familiar items. Air out the linens in the back garden. Check the roof tiles for winter damage. Sweep the front steps and clear away any wind-blown leaves. Restock the pantry for spring guests. Arrange fresh flowers for the common room. Her first task was the linens. She carried the stack out to the back garden, where the air smelled faintly of salt and damp earth. The sky was still overcast, but the breeze was steady and cool. Shelley set up the wooden drying rack, draping sheets and pillowcases over the rails, pinning them in place with the warm clothespins she kept in a little tin box. The fabric caught the wind, fluttering gently, snapping lightly with each gust. It was a small satisfaction to watch them sway, soft, clean, and sun-bleached by the time she would bring them back inside. From there, she moved to the front steps, broom in hand, her movements slow and steady. The salt air had dusted the wood with a fine candles whispering against the boards. When she finished, she stood back to admire her work, watching as the wind carried away the last stray leaves. Guests were few in March. There had been a writer from the city who stayed for a week, quiet and polite. He spent most of his time at the little desk in room 2, his typewriter clacking faintly through the walls. Shelley had left him to his work, only exchanging a few words each morning when she brought him fresh towels. He had left a thank you note on the front desk when he checked out, neatly folded with a sprig of dried lavender pressed inside. Shelley had tucked it away in the drawer with the others, a quiet memory folded into the wood. The rest of the rooms stayed empty, their curtains drawn back to let in the pale light. Shelley moved through them with gentle efficiency, cracking the windows to let in fresh air, smoothing the covers, dusting the window ledges. But she didn't linger. The rooms would be filled soon enough, and she liked them best when they were left in quiet readiness. By mid-March, the first daffodils had begun to sprout along the edge of the garden path, their yellow heads bobbing gently in the wind. Shelley made a habit of cutting a few each morning, arranging them in small vases that she placed on the windowsills and the mantel in the common room. It brightened the space, the little bursts of colour catching the light when the sun finally broke through the clouds. Afternoons were spent in slow preparation. She restocked the pantry, taking quiet inventory of the jars of preserves, tins of tea, and bags of flour and sugar. She polished the silver in the dining room, the cloth moving in slow, deliberate circles until the handles gleamed. She checked the roof tiles one sunny afternoon, pulling on her thick gardening gloves and climbing the narrow ladder at the side of the house. The shingles had weathered the storms well, and she made a note to recoat them in May, just as she did every year. When the sky was clear, she would take her tea out to the bench at the edge of the dunes, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The waves rolled in slowly, their crests curling up to the sand in gentle whispers. The beach was still empty, just the cry of distant gulls and the sigh of the wind. She would sit there for a while, watching the horizon stretch out like a thin ribbon of silver, her hands cradling the warmth of her cup. Evenings came softly, the light stretching a little longer as the days grew warmer. Shelley would light a few lamps in the common room, pulling the curtains closed against the creeping chill. Supper was always simple, a bowl of soup or a slice of bread with a bit of cheese. She ate in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind against the shutters. After the dishes were washed and dried, she would settle into her chair with her knitting. The needles clicked softly, her hands moving in the same familiar rhythm. Outside, the waves continued their endless rhythm, washing up against the shore before retreating back into the deep. March was slow, unhurried, a gentle bridge between the harshness of winter and the soft promise of spring. April, the bloom of spring and gentle preparations. Outside, the beach was slowly coming back to life. The sand had dried from winter's dampness, and the beach grass had begun to grow in earnest, stretching up in soft tufts that swayed with each breeze. When the kettle whistled, she poured the water over the tea leaves and let it steep. Her breakfast was unchanged. 2 slices of toast buttered lightly with a thin layer of marmalade. She took her place by the window, watching the light spill slowly over the dunes, the sea stretching out in gentle rolls. Gulls floated overhead, their calls sharper now, more insistent, as if they too felt the change in the air. April was the time for preparing the garden. It sat behind the inn, a modest patch of earth bordered by a low stone wall that had been there for generations. Shelley stepped out with her basket of tools one cool morning, the grass still damp beneath her boots. She had already turned the soil the week before, the earth dark and soft, ready for planting. Her gloves were thick, the leather worn smooth where her palms had gripped the handles of spades and shears for years. She began with the herb patch, kneeling down to press fresh rosemary and thyme into the soil. Each sprig was settled gently, her hands smoothing the earth around the roots before she moved on. Lavender went into the far corner where the sunlight lingered longest. She imagined how it would look come June, the purple flowers stretching toward the sky, swaying gently in the breeze. After the herbs were planted, she moved on to the flower beds. Daffodils had already bloomed in bright, cheerful clusters, and she added primroses and forget-me-nots along the border. She worked slowly, pausing now and then to straighten her back and look out over the dunes. The sea was calm today, waves lapping gently against the shore, their rhythm steady and unchanging. When the planting was done, she brushed the soil from her gloves, hung them carefully on the peg in the back hallway, and went back inside to wash her hands. The scent of earth lingered on her skin, rich and familiar. She filled the kettle once more and set it on the stove, waiting patiently for it to boil. While she waited, she pulled out her spring ledger from the drawer of the front desk. Thus, past, cover was leather, cracked along the spine. The pages filled with careful notes and neat handwriting. She flipped to the current page and ran her finger down the list. Fresh linens for the guest rooms, oil the hinges on the back door, sweep the chimney before summer, repaint the garden fence. Spring always brought with it a quiet flurry of tasks. Shelley moved through them with a steady, unhurried pace, finding comfort in each small completion. That afternoon, she set about repainting the garden fence, the can of white paint heavy in her hands as she carried it outside. She stirred it carefully, the wooden stick scraping gently against the bottom of the can before she dipped her brush in and began. The brush strokes were smooth, the bristles sweeping over the wood with practiced ease. She worked her way along the fence line, the smell of fresh paint mingling with the salt breeze. The gulls gently by the window. They stayed mostly to themselves, wandering the beach in the mornings and reading by the fire in the afternoons. They left her a tin of shortbread when they checked out, wrapped neatly in a blue ribbon. Later that week, a woman travelling alone booked 2 nights in room 3. She arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm and spent long hours sitting at the small desk by the window, watching the tide come in and out. Shelly brought her fresh towels and a pot of tea each morning, nodding politely as she set the tray on the dresser. The woman always thanked her softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Shelley cleaned the rooms after they left, her movements steady and careful. The sheets were stripped and washed, the windows open to let in the fresh air. She dusted the dressers, vacuumed the floors, and fluffed the pillows, moving with the same practiced grace she had honed over the years. By the time she finished, the rooms looked untouched, ready again for the next visitor who wandered through. In the common room, Shelley set out fresh flowers in small vases, their colours bright against the wooden mantel. The fire remained unlit now that the chill had softened, but the room still held the faint scent of ash and pine. She dusted the shelves, straightened the cushions, and checked the clock on the mantel. Its hands moved in slow, patient ticks, marking the quiet passage of the days. The afternoons grew warmer, and Shelley would often take her tea outside, settling onto the bench at the edge of the dunes. She watched the waves roll in, steady and unhurried, their crests catching the light before sinking back into the deep. Seagulls drifted lazily across the sky, their wings cutting smooth lines through the air. She sipped her tea and listened to the world breathe, soft and untroubled. Evenings passed in the same gentle rhythm. She would prepare a simple supper, perhaps a bit of soup or a thick slice of bread with jam, and eat it by the kitchen window. The light lingered longer now, stretching across the floorboards in thin golden stripes. After the dishes were washed and dried, she would settle into her chair with her knitting, her hands moving with familiar ease as the needles clicked softly in the silence. April drifted by in slow waves, each day unfolding gently, unhurried. The flowers in the garden began to bloom in earnest, splashes of colour brightening the stone path. The sea, constant and steady, whispered against the shore, and the seaside inn stood quietly, its windows open to the salt and the wind. May, the sea, bloom of spring and the whisper of summer. May drifted in on a salt-tinged breeze, brushing softly through the dunes and stirring the beach grass with whispers of warmer days. its silhouette a dark smudge against the pale sky. Shelly sipped her tea and watched it bob along the surface, moving slowly, unhurried. May was a time for outdoor maintenance. The inn had weathered many storms, its stone walls thick and sturdy, but spring always called for gentle care. Shelly began with the windows, gathering her bucket of soapy water, a worn sponge, and a clean rag. One by one, she worked her way around the building, scrubbing away the winter's salt streaks and the fine layer of dust that had settled with each gust of wind. The glass gleamed in the sunlight, clear and bright, offering unblemished views of the sea and the dunes. She took her time with each pane, rinsing the cloth in cool water, wiping down the wooden frames before moving on. It was slow work, but satisfying, each window sparkling by the time she finished. When the windows were done, she moved on to the patio furniture. The wooden chairs and small tables had been stacked and covered for the winter, their surfaces grey with dust and salt. Shelley uncovered them slowly, brushing away the sand that had settled into the corners. She wiped them down with a soft cloth, scrubbing gently at the spots where the paint had begun to chip. When they were clean, she arranged them neatly on the back patio, setting the chairs just so, with their backs to the gentle sea breeze. Guests began to arrive more frequently now. A young couple from the north spent a weekend in room 2, their sea, laughter drifting softly through the open windows as they walked hand in hand along the beach. They had arrived with matching yellow raincoats and well-worn suitcases, their cheeks flushed from the drive. Shelley checked them in quietly, carrying their bags up the stairs and leaving them to settle in. They wandered the dunes in the mornings, their footprints trailing behind them in the sand, and in the afternoons they sat in the common room, reading quietly by the window. Shelley brought them fresh towels each morning and hot tea each evening, nodding politely as she set the tray down on the small table near the fireplace. They left on a Sunday, early in the morning, with soft words of thanks and promises to return in the fall. Shelley watched from the front steps as their car pulled away, the dust kicking up along the narrow road before settling back into stillness. She spent the rest of the morning cleaning the room, opening the windows to let in the fresh sea air, changing the linens and dusting the dresser. By the time she was done, room 2 was spotless and waiting, its curtains drawn back, the bed neatly made, untouched and ready for the next visitor. As the days grew warmer, Shelley turned her attention to the flower beds in the garden. The daffodils had faded, their yellow petals curling back, but the lavender was beginning to bloom in earnest, its pale purple blossoms nodding gently in the breeze. She took her gardening shears and trimmed back the edges, smoothing the soil with her hands and pulling the few weeds that had crept in. On a particularly warm afternoon, scent of earth and sea mingled in the air, drifting up with each gentle gust of wind. In the common room, Shelley set out small vases of fresh cut flowers, lavender sprigs, daisies, and a few wild flowers she had gathered from the edge of the dunes. The scent was light and clean, mingling with the salt air that drifted in through the open windows. She dusted the shelves, polished the brass on the fireplace screen, and swept the floorboards with long, steady strokes of the broom. Afternoons often found her on the back patio, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her eyes watching the water move gently against the shore. The waves were softer now, less bracing than they had been in winter, their rhythm steady and soothing. Sometimes she would take out her knitting, her hands moving with familiar ease as she added rows to the long grey scarf she'd been working on since January. Evenings came slower in May, the light lingering along the horizon, stretching thin strands of gold across the water. Shelley would light the lamps in the common room, pulling the curtains closed just as the sun dipped below the dunes. Supper was always simple, a bit of soup, perhaps, or fresh bread with jam. She ate quietly, her eyes drifting now and then to the window, where the last light of day settled soft and warm against the glass. When the dishes were washed and put away, she would settle into her chair, the knitting resting softly in her lap. The needles clicked gently in the silence, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore, its lullaby soft and unchanging. May drifted by, unhurried and gentle, its days stretching out with soft warmth. The seaside inn waking slowly to the first touch of summer. June, the slow rise of summer, and the soft lull of waves. June arrived with a whisper of warmth, the breeze carrying with it the scent of salt and fresh blooms from the garden. The mornings were brighter now, sunlight spilling across the wooden floors of the seaside inn, stretching long and golden as it crept through the windows. Shelley woke as she always did, just before dawn, the soft ticking of her alarm clock marking the start of another gentle day. The kitchen was filled with soft light when she descended the stairs. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and listened to the quiet hum of water heating. Outside, the dunes were brushed with green, the beach grass thick and swaying in the breeze. The sea was calm, its waves rolling in slow, steady patterns, whispering against the sand before retreating back to the depths. Her breakfast remained unchanged. 2 slices of toast, buttered and topped with marmalade. Shelley ate it by the window, watching as the first rays of sun touched the edge of the horizon, spreading out across the water in ribbons of light. Gulls drifted lazily over the shore, their calls sharper now, cutting cleanly through the morning. Stillness. June marked the beginning of summer preparations. The seaside inn would see more visitors now, those looking for the solitude of the coast, the gentle rhythm of waves, and the quiet charm of the inn. Shelley pulled out her summer's ledger from the front desk drawer, its cover soft from years set to work. The brush scraped along the brick, sending down little clouds of ash that settled softly in the grate. She moved slowly and carefully, humming a little tune under her breath as she worked. When she finished, she swept the hearth clean, dusted it off her hands, and closed the flue with a satisfying click. Next, she moved to the patio furniture. The cushions had been stored away during the winter months, their fabric still bright and unblemished. Shelly carried them out, one by one, brushing off any stray bits of lint before placing them on the chairs. She arranged the small tables just so, setting out fresh vases filled with lavender sprigs and wildflowers. The back patio overlooked the dunes, and from her favourite chair she could just make out the line where the sky met the sea, stretching out in endless blue. Guests began to arrive steadily as the days grew longer. A family from the countryside booked room 1 for the week, their voices bright with laughter as they unpacked their bags in the front hall. Shelley carried their luggage up the stairs, her hands steady on the banister, listening as the children ran ahead, their footsteps light and quick. They spent their days on the beach, building castles that washed away with each incoming tide, only to be rebuilt the next morning with the same careful enthusiasm. In the afternoons, Shelley would bring them lemonade in tall glasses, the ice clinking softly as she set the tray down on the patio table. The parents always thanked her warmly, their cheeks flushed from the sun, their hands still sandy from the shore. She would nod, smile politely, and retreat back inside to tend to the inn's quiet tasks. That same week, a painter arrived and took room 4. He was older, with grey hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and hands that were permanently smudged with charcoal and paint. He set up his easel on the dunes each morning, working quietly as the light stretched over the water. Shelley would see him from the kitchen window, his figure still and steady, the canvas before him catching glimpses of sky and sea. He kept to himself mostly, though he would nod politely each time she brought him fresh linens or a pot of tea. Evenings at the inn took on a softer glow as the days stretched longer. Shelley would light the lamps in the common room, their warm light pooling in soft circles on the floor. The guests would gather sometimes, reading quietly or chatting in low voices, their faces relaxed and unhurried. She would set out a small tray of biscuits and tea, arranging it carefully on the low table by the fire, even if the flames remained unlit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Shelley would lock the front door, pulling the curtains closed against the growing dusk. The beach would fall silent, save for the soft whisper of waves and the occasional call of a night gull. She would make herself a simple supper, soup or perhaps a bit of fish and fresh bread, and eat it slowly, watching the last light fade from the windows. When the dishes were washed and put away, she would take her tea out to the patio, settling into her favourite chair, evening air was still cool, but there was a softness to it now, a whisper of summer's promise. She watched the water, the waves catching the moonlight as they rolled in slow, deliberate patterns. The light flickered off their crests, tiny sparks of silver dancing before sinking back into the depths. Inside, the guests would be settling into their rooms. The quiet hum of voices and the occasional creak of floorboards marking the rhythm of the inn. Shelley would listen to the sounds as she knitted, her hands moving with familiar ease, the needles clicking softly in the silence. June passed that way, slow, steady and unhurried. The days stretched longer. The light lingered in the windows and the seaside inn hummed with quiet life. July, the heart of summer and the steady tide of guests. July swept in with a warmth that lingered in the morning air, soft and steady. The sun climbed higher each day, stretching long rays of light across the dunes and warming the sand until it shimmered beneath the noonday sky. Shelley woke as she always did, just before dawn. The familiar tick of her alarm clock marking the quiet start of another summer day. The kitchen was bright with early sunlight when she padded downstairs. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and waited as steam curled slowly from the spout. Outside, the beach grass swayed lazily, their tips brushing against each other in the soft breeze. The waves rolled in steady, unhurried lines, their crests catching the light before collapsing back into the depths. Her breakfast was unchanged, 2 slices of toast, buttered and topped with a thin layer of marmalade. She ate by the window, watching the light spill over the dunes and scatter across the beach. Gulls tipped and soared, their cries cutting through the stillness. Small shells and bits of driftwood dotted the sand, washed up from the tide's gentle retreat. July was when the inn truly woke from its quiet slumber. Guests arrived steadily, some for the weekend, others for longer stretches of time. Shelley kept the check-in ledger open on the front desk, its pages filling neatly with names and dates. The leather cover was smooth and worn, its edges softened by years of handling. Each name was written in a careful hand, each room marked with quiet precision. A family from the city arrived one bright afternoon, their car packed with beach towels and wicker baskets. They took room 3 and room 4, their laughter echoing up the stairwell as Shelley carried their bags and showed them to their rooms. The children spilled out onto the dunes almost immediately, their footprints trailing behind them as they chased each other along the shore. Shelley watched Sometimes she would bake simple scones with currants or a batch of oatmeal biscuits. The scent would drift through the inn, mingling with the salt air and the faint trace of lavender from the sachets she kept tucked into the linen drawers. When the afternoons grew long and the sun hung lazily over the water, she would take her tea out to the back garden, settling into the wooden chair she kept beneath the shade of the old oak tree. The garden was in full bloom now, the lavender tall and bright, the marigolds nodding cheerfully along the path. Bees drifted lazily between the petals, their hum soft and unhurried. Shelley would sit there with her knitting, the soft click of the needles a steady rhythm as she watched the waves beyond the dunes. Evenings at the inn were gentle and warm. The guests would gather on the patio, their voices low and pleasant, laughter spilling out softly as the light faded. Shelley would light the small lanterns that hung along the porch, their glow casting soft circles of light across the wooden boards. She would set out pitchers of lemonade and trays of biscuits, nodding politely as guests helped themselves. The sun dipped below the horizon slowly in July, lingering on the edge of the water before slipping away. Shelley would close the shutters one by one, latching them quietly and drawing the curtains in the common room. The gentle murmur of guests settling into their rooms would drift down the stairwell, a soft backdrop to the crackle of the fire she sometimes lit on cooler nights. Her own evenings were spent in quiet reflection. She would settle into her favourite chair by the window, her hands busy with her knitting, her eyes occasionally drifting to the view of the dunes bathed in moonlight. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore, its waves moving in patient rhythm. Shelley listened to the sound as she worked, her hands moving steadily, the yarn soft against her fingers. July passed that way, slow, warm and unhurried. The guests came and went, their voices trailing up the stairwells and spilling out onto the patio. The waves rolled in steady procession, and the seaside inn stood quietly, its windows open to the breeze, its rooms filled with the gentle hum of summer. August, the full embrace of summer and the whisper of the tide. August arrived with a thick warmth that settled over the seaside inn, stretching across the dunes and drifting in through the open windows. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long golden light over the beach grass that swayed in slow, lazy rhythms. Shelley woke each morning before dawn, the soft click of her alarm clock marking the start of another summer day. Downstairs, the kitchen was bright with morning light, the wooden floorboards warm beneath her feet. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and watched as steam began to curl slowly from the spout. Outside, the tide had pulled back, revealing smooth stretches of sand dotted with shells and bits of driftwood. Gulls wheeled overhead, its rooms occupied with travellers who sought the cool whisper of the tide and the soft breeze drifting off the water. There were couples who booked room 1, their laughter drifting softly through the open windows as they shared quiet breakfasts on the patio. A painter returned to room 4, setting up his easel along the dunes, just as he had in June. He worked with quiet concentration, his brushes moving steadily across the canvas as the sunlight stretched over the waves. Occasionally, Shelley would bring him a pot of tea and some biscuits, setting them quietly on the little table by the window. He always nodded his thanks, his eyes never leaving the view. Room 3 was occupied by a grandmother and her 2 grandchildren. They arrived, with suitcases packed tightly, their voices bright with excitement as Shelley showed them upstairs. The children spent their days collecting shells along the beach, their buckets filled with tiny treasures they brought back each evening to show their grandmother. She would listen patiently, her eyes soft with affection as they spread their finds across the small wooden table in the common room. In the garden, the lavender was in full bloom, stretching tall and fragrant along the stone path. Shelley took her shears one warm afternoon and began to trim back the edges, her hands moving. Slowly, carefully, she gathered the cuttings into small bundles, tying them with twine before hanging them in the back pantry to dry. The scent filled the room, rich and clean, mingling with the faint trace of salt that drifted in through the open window. The back patio was busier now. Guests would gather there in the late afternoons, sipping lemonade or iced tea, their conversations mingling with the soft rush of the waves. Shelley would set out trays of biscuits and small plates of fresh scones, the butter soft from the warmth of the day. She moved quietly between the tables, her hands steady, her steps light. Sometimes she would linger for just a moment, looking out over the dunes where the grass moved like waves in the breeze. In the common room, she dusted the shelves, straightened the cushions, and polished the mantel where the old clock ticked steadily. The windows were left open now, their curtains drawn back to let the sunlight spill in. The air smelled faintly of lavender and sea salt, a gentle reminder of the summer that settled around them. Evenings were long and warm. The guests would drift back from the beach, their shoes in hand, sand clinging to the cuffs of their trousers. They would shake it off quietly at the door, nodding politely to Shelley as they passed. She would light the lamps in the common room, their soft glow spilling out across the wooden floors. Sometimes she would set out a pot of tea and a plate of shortbread, the edges dusted with sugar. When the sun dipped lower, casting the dunes in long shadows, Shelley would step out on to the back patio. The wooden chair she favoured creaked gently as she settled into it, her hands cradling a cup of tea. The air was warm, still clinging to the last of the day. August was unhurried and full. The days spilled into one another with the soft hum of guests, the whisper of waves, and the gentle creak of floorboards beneath sandy feet. Shelley moved through her routines with practiced grace, changing linens, sweeping the steps, trimming the lavender, and setting out fresh flowers in the windowsills. The inn breathed with life, its rooms filled with quiet conversations and the rustle of turning pages. The evenings came slower in August, lingering on the horizon as if reluctant to leave. Shelley would lock the front door, as she always did, pulling the curtains closed and lighting the hallway lamp that flickered softly beside the stairs. She would take her knitting into the common room, settling into the armchair by the window, her hands moving steadily as the needles clicked softly. In the silence, outside, the waves continued their gentle rhythm, washing up against the shore before slipping back to sea. The gulls would settle in the sand, their wings tucked neatly, their cries softened to faint whispers. The inn stood quietly, its windows open to the breeze, its halls filled with the warm hum of summer. September, the slow drift into autumn and the whisper of change. September arrived with a breath of cool air that slipped through the cracks in the window panes and stirred the curtains in gentle whispers. The mornings grew crisper, the sunlight softer, its glow stretching longer across the floorboards of the seaside inn. Shelley woke each day just before dawn, her alarm clock clicking softly in the half-darkness. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way downstairs. In the kitchen, the light was pale and thin, filtered through the early mist that clung to the dunes. Shelley filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and watched as the steam began to curl slowly from the spout. Outside, the beach lay empty and quiet, the sand smoothed by the night tide, stretching out in long, pale ribbons toward the water. Gulls picked lazily along the shoreline, their calls softened by the morning fog. Her breakfast was unchanged. 2 slices of toast, buttered and spread with marmalade. She ate slowly, her eyes watching the mist roll back over the dunes, revealing patches of beach grass still heavy with dew. The waves moved in soft whispers, gentler now, the summer's rush fading to a slower rhythm. September marked the beginning of seasonal preparations at the inn. Shelley moved at her usual pace, steady and unhurried, but her tasks shifted subtly with the change in the air. First came the gardens. The lavender had long since been cut and dried, hanging in neat bundles in the back pantry. Now Shelley turned her attention to the hydrangeas that bordered the path to the beach. Their blooms, once full and bright, had begun to fade, their petals curling gently at the edges. She trimmed them back carefully, her shears snipping softly in the cool morning light. After the pruning was done, she turned her attention to the garden furniture, the wooden chairs and small set out in May was still sturdy, but the paint had chipped in places from the summer sun and salt air. Shelly brought out her paint cans, soft white for the tables, sea blue for the chairs, and spent the better part of an afternoon repainting them. The brush strokes were smooth and deliberate, the paint spreading evenly under her careful hand. She hummed quietly as she worked, the tune drifting out over the garden and disappearing into the wind. Guests came and went with more space between their arrivals now. A writer from the city took room 2 for a full week, her typewriter clicking softly through the thin walls in the early morning hours. Shelly would bring her a pot of tea each day, setting it down quietly on the little table by the window. The writer would nod politely, her eyes already back on the keys, fingers poised above them. When she left, she thanked Shelly with a soft smile and a neatly folded note that simply read, "Thank you for the quiet." A couple from the south took room 3 for a long weekend, their voices soft and unhurried as they sat on the back patio, watching the waves roll in. They left her a jar of fig preserves when they checked out, tied with a bit of twine and a note that read, "From our garden to yours." Shelley placed it carefully in the pantry, next to her own rows of jam and marmalade. In the common room, she began the slow process of preparing for the cooler months. The thick woven blankets she kept in the linen cupboard were brought out, aired on the back railing for an afternoon, before being folded neatly and placed in the wicker basket beside the hearth. She dusted the shelves as she always did, polished the mantel and straightened the cushions. The windows were left open on warm afternoons, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and drying leaves through the room. Shelley also took time to mend the curtains in room 4. The hem had come loose, fraying just slightly from the constant brushing against the windowsill. She brought out a sewing basket, the wooden lid creaking softly as she lifted it open. Her needle moved in slow, careful stitches, the fabric pulled tight across her lap. The sunlight slanted through the window, catching the dust motes as they drifted lazily in the air. Afternoons grew quieter as the light stretched longer across the dunes. The beach was mostly empty now, save for the occasional wanderer or local fisherman casting his line into the waves. Shelley would sometimes take her tea out to the bench at the edge of the garden, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She watched the waves move in slow procession, their crests whispering against the shore before retreating back into the deep. One particular afternoon, she noticed the first hint of autumn leaves curling at the edges of the trees that lined the path to town. Their green had softened, edged now with the faintest hint of gold. It would be weeks yet before the full change, but the first signs were there, quiet and patient. Shelley watched them from her chair, her knitting resting in her lap, her hands still for just a moment as she listened to the soft rustle of the leaves. Evenings came earlier now, voices hushed by the settling dark, Shelley would set out a tray of tea and scones, her movements steady and unhurried. When the fire was lit, its soft crackle filled the room with warmth. The guests would gather, reading or talking in low voices as the flames flickered against the stone hearth. Shelley watched from her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked, the yarn stretching neatly between her hands. Outside, the waves moved in their endless rhythm, brushing against the sand with soft, unhurried patience. September drifted by with slow certainty. The beach grew quieter, the air a little crisper, and the seaside inn settled into the gentle embrace of early autumn. The days shortened, the light softened, and Shelley moved through her routines with steady grace, her hands working quietly as the seasons slipped gently onward. October, the slow fall of leaves and the whisper of autumn winds. October arrived with a crispness in the air that slipped through the window cracks and stirred the curtains in gentle waves. The mornings were colder now, the sunlight pale and thin as it stretched over the dunes. Shelley woke as she always did, the soft click of her alarm clock marking the start of another day. She pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders before heading downstairs, her slippers scuffing lightly against the wooden floor. The kitchen was cool and still, the windows fogged slightly from the dawn chill. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and watched as steam curled up from the spout, drifting lazily through the air. Outside, the beach was covered with a thin layer of mist that clung to the sand and softened the edges of the dunes. The waves moved more slowly now, their crests thick and heavy as they washed up against the shore. Her breakfast remained the same: 2 slices of toast, buttered and spread with marmalade. She ate quietly by the window, watching as the mist began to lift, revealing patches of beach grass still slick with dew. The gulls flew lower now, their wings cutting through the brisk morning air, their cries sharper against the soft hush of the waves. October was a time for preparations. The summer rush had faded, leaving the inn quieter now, its rooms empty more often than not. Shelley turned her attention to the garden first. The marigolds had wilted with the first frost, their petals browning at the edges, drooping toward the soil. She pulled on her gardening gloves, their leather cracked and soft from years of use, and knelt beside the beds. One by one, she trimmed back the flowers, cutting away the dead leaves and pulling the weeds that had crept in over the last few weeks. The lavender she left untouched, its grey-green stems still standing tall, though the blossoms had long since faded. She would trim it back in November, just before the first heavy frost. For now, she simply cleared away the fallen leaves that had gathered at its base, brushing them aside with slow, deliberate movements. When the garden or a solitary writer seeking the quiet of the coast. A woman in her 50s took room 1 for a week, her luggage light, her smile kind but reserved. She spent her mornings walking the beach, her scarf trailing behind her in the wind, and her afternoons sitting in the common room, a book in her lap and a cup of tea on the small table beside her. Shelly would bring her fresh towels each morning, nodding politely as she knocked gently on the door. The woman always answered with a soft smile and a whispered thank you, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When she left, she slipped a thin paperback novel onto the common room shelf, its spine uncreased, its pages crisp. Shelly dusted it carefully before tucking it between the others, its title just visible from the edge. In the common room, Shelly began to prepare for the colder days to come. She brought out the heavier curtains, their fabric thick and woven, and hung them with slow precision. The soft thud of the fabric settling into place filled the room with a sense of warmth, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer. She dusted the mantel, straightened the cushions, and laid out thicker throws on the backs of the armchairs. One afternoon, she pulled out the wool blankets from the linen cupboard, airing them on the back patio rail. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of sea salt and drying leaves. Shelley watched as the blankets fluttered gently in the wind, their edges lifting and falling with each gust. She folded them neatly when they were done, placing them back in the common room basket, ready for the first true chill of the season. The afternoons grew quieter, the light stretching long and low across the dunes. Shelley would sometimes take her tea to the edge of the garden, settling onto the wooden bench that faced the sea. The beach was mostly empty now, save for a stray dog that wandered the shore from time to time, its coat wet and matted from the waves. Shelley would watch it from her seat, its silhouette dark against the pale sand, its movements slow and unhurried. The first real windstorm of the season came one evening, sweeping in from the north with a gust that rattled the shutters and sent leaves skittering across the stone path. Shelley closed the windows carefully, her hands steady as she latched each one against the wind. She drew the curtains tightly and lit the lamps, their soft glow spreading through the common room with a warmth that pressed back against the chill. That night she lit a fire in the hearth, the flames crackling softly as they grew, spreading warmth through the room. The guests, just 3 of them, gathered near the flames, their voices low, their hands cradling cups of tea. Shelley moved quietly among them, setting out a small tray of shortbread and nodding politely as they murmured their thanks. When the last light faded from the horizon, Shelley took her place by the window, her knitting resting in her lap. The storm howled gently outside, the wind brushing against the walls of the inn with soft insistence. She watched the waves crash against the rocks, their crests catching downstairs. A mop's kitchen was cool, the air sharp with the faint bite of salt and winter's edge. Shelly filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and watched as the steam curled gently into the morning stillness. Outside, the beach lay hushed and empty, the sand smoothed by the tide, stretching out in quiet shades of grey and silver. The waves moved slowly now, their rhythm heavier, dragging against the shore before slipping back into the depths. Her breakfast was unchanged. 2 slices of toast, buttered and topped with marmalade. She ate quietly by the window, her breath fogging the glass just slightly as she watched the gulls wheel overhead. The wind had a sharper edge to it now, brushing against the beach grass and sending dry leaves tumbling across the sand. November was a time for sealing and storing. The inn needed to be readied for the long winter months ahead, and Shelley moved through her preparations with quiet deliberation. She began with the windows, taking down the lighter summer curtains and replacing them with heavier, thicker ones, in deep shades of burgundy and slate grey. They hung neatly, their folds soft and heavy, keeping the draughts at bay. Shelley ran her hands over the fabric, smoothing out the edges, making sure they fell just right. Next, she moved to the storm. Shutters, they were heavy and wooden, stored in the small shed behind the garden. Shelley pulled them out one by one, brushing away the thin layer of dust that had settled over the summer. She carried them around the building, propping them up against each window before fastening them with thick iron latches. The wind whispered through the cracks as she worked, stirring the fallen leaves that had gathered in small piles along the path. When the shutters were secure, she took her broom and swept the front steps, her movements slow and steady. The leaves skittered away with each stroke, swirling off into the wind before settling again further down the path. The wood beneath her feet creaked softly, its boards worn smooth from years of weather and footsteps. Guests were few and far. Between now, just the occasional traveller seeking a warm bed for the night. A fisherman stayed for 2 days in room 5, his boots leaving faint traces of sand along the hallway. He left early each morning, his coat pulled tightly around him, his hat low over his brow. Shelley would watch him from the kitchen window as he walked down the beach, his silhouette dark against the pale sky, his footsteps disappearing into the tide's slow pull. He left quietly on a misty Wednesday morning, slipping his key onto the counter and nodding his thanks before stepping out into the chill. Shelley watched him go, the door clicking softly shut behind him, and then she turned to clean the room. Her hands moved with practiced care, stripping the bed, fluffing the pillows, wiping down the windowsill. She opened the window just for a moment, letting the cold air each afternoon, the flames crackling softly and spreading warmth through the room. The windows remained shuttered now, their curtains drawn against the chill. She laid out the thicker woolen blankets over the backs of the chairs and set small bundles of dried lavender on the mantel. The scent mingled with the wood smoke, drifting softly through the space and settling into the corners. Shelley also turned her attention to pantry preparations. She took inventory of the shelves, running her hands over the jars of preserves and tins of tea. She made a list in her careful handwriting, marking down flour, sugar, and dried herbs that needed to be restocked. On a particularly brisk morning, she walked into town, her thick wool coat buttoned up to her chin, and her hands tucked deep into her pockets. The shopkeepers greeted her with nods and polite smiles, their voices muffled by scarves and the soft hum of the heater that rattled in the corner. When she returned, she set to work organising the shelves. The bags of flour were placed neatly in the corner, the sugar tins stacked in even rows. She lined up the jars of jam and marmalade, wiping the lids clean before setting them back in their places. Everything was ready, prepared for the long stretch of winter that lay ahead. Afternoons grew shorter, the light slipping away by late afternoon, leaving the inn bathed in soft lamplight. Shelley would take her tea to the back patio sometimes, wrapping herself in her shawl and settling into the wooden chair beneath the overhang. The waves moved more slowly now, their rhythm heavier, their whispers softer. She would sip her tea and watch the clouds gather on the horizon, thick and grey, promising the first dusting of snow. One evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, she noticed the first flakes begin to fall. They drifted down softly, swirling in the wind before settling gently on the sand and the tops of the dunes. Shelley watched from her chair, her hands stilling for a moment, the needles resting softly against her lap. The fire crackled beside her, its warmth spreading through the room, pressing back the chill that gathered at the edges of the glass. November passed slowly and quietly, the days shorter, the light softer, the air sharper with each passing week. The seaside inn settled into its winter stillness, its windows shuttered, its fires lit, its rooms waiting patiently for the next guest to arrive. Shelley moved through her routines with gentle grace, her hands steady, her pace unhurried, as the world outside turned slowly toward winter's embrace. December, the stillness of winter and the quiet closing of a year. December arrived with the soft hush of snow blanketing the dunes and the slow sigh of the sea rolling in quiet rhythm against the shore. The mornings were darker now, the sky pale and muted as dawn crept over the horizon. Shelley woke each day as she always did, the steady ticking of her alarm clock marking the start December brought with it the final preparations for winter. Shelley moved through her tasks with practiced grace, her hands steady and unhurried. She began with the entryway, sweeping away the bits of snow that had blown in during the night and shaking out the doormat before laying it back in its place. She polished the brass doorknob until it gleamed faintly in the morning light, its surface smooth and cool beneath her hand. Next, she turned her attention to the guest rooms. They sat empty now, the beds made and the windows shuttered against the chill. She moved through each one, dusting the window ledges, smoothing the covers, and tucking fresh sachets of lavender beneath the pillows. It would be quiet now until spring. Just the occasional traveller passing through, seeking warmth and rest before moving on again. In the common room, she set out soft woolen blankets over the backs of the armchairs and arranged small bundles of pine cones and dried orange slices on the mantel. The scent was faint but pleasant, mingling with the trace of wood smoke that lingered in the air. Shelley dusted the shelves, straightened the cushions, and polished the small brass clock that ticked softly on the side table. Holiday preparations came slowly, spread out over the weeks leading up to Christmas. She brought down the box of decorations from the attic, carefully packed away the year before. The glass ornaments were unwrapped one by one, their surfaces smooth and cool, reflecting the light from the window in soft glimmers. She hung them gently on the small tree she had set up in the corner of the common room, the branches filling the space with the scent of pine. She strung a length of white lights along the mantel, their glow soft and steady, casting faint shadows against the stone. On the table by the window, she placed a small dish of sugared almonds and a plate of shortbread dusted lightly with powdered sugar. The fire crackled quietly in the hearth, its warmth spreading through the room, pressing back the chill that gathered at the edges of the glass. Guests were rare in December, but there were a few. Travellers passing through, their cheeks pink from the cold, their voices hushed by the stillness of the season. An elderly couple stayed for a weekend in room 1, their bags light, their smiles soft and familiar. They spent their mornings walking along the frozen edge of the shore, their footsteps crisp and clear in the frost. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sharing quiet conversation over cups of tea, their hands wrapped gently around the warm ceramic. When they left, they thanked Shelly with soft-spoken words and left a small parcel wrapped in brown paper on the front desk. Shelley opened it after they had gone, finding a jar of plum preserves and a note written in tidy script for the warmth and the quiet. Thank you. Shelley placed it on the pantry shelf beside the others, her hands moving slowly and carefully. As Christmas approached, Shelley decorated the front porch with a simple wreath of pine and sprigs of holly tied with a thin red ribbon. The snow gathered gently at the corners, piling up softly against the steps. She swept it away each morning Soup